Hello, my name is Steve, and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. When the United States finally entered World War I on April 4th, 1917, it came as no surprise that the railroads were going to play an essential role in the American war effort. The explosive growth of American railroads in the decades following the Civil War resulted in infrastructure that was beginning to show its age by the turn of the 20th century. The boom-bust cycle of the American economy of the late 19th and early 20th century resulted in a lack of adequate investment in railroad plant equipment. The financial crisis of 1893 and the panic of 1907 didn't help matters either. With the U.S. entry into World War I, the railroads were now faced with a challenge they were ill prepared for. Everything from aging infrastructure to the need for more motive power, inadequate port facilities, and railcar shortages were all coming to a head. It was a huge mess, and the railroads didn't seem inclined to clean it up on their own. So, enter the U.S. government and the creation of the United States Railroad Administration, or USRA. We're going to take a look at what prompted the U.S. government to take over the nation's railroads and what the USRA actually accomplished between 1917 and 1920. All this and more coming up next on American Steam Legacy. The circumstances that left the railroads primed for government intervention didn't happen overnight. By the turn of the 20th century, the railroads were in dire need of new investment, and the panic of 1907 temporarily derailed those plans. Between 1908 and 1916, American railroads borrowed $4 billion for improvements. While these improvements resulted in a higher operating revenue, an increase of $450 million by 1915, the interest charges on the $4 billion debt was costing them $500,000 a day. Even though the railroads were able to charge higher rates, higher labor costs and debt service consumed the additional revenue and then some. By 1917, things were no better for American railroads than they were 10 years earlier. In fact, they were worse. Port facilities on the U.S. East Coast were inadequate and congested with railroad cars, many of which were in poor state of repair. Many locomotives that should have been transferred to yard service or retired altogether were still in mainline service. The congestion at eastern seaports created several problems. Loaded rail cars couldn't get in because of the accumulation of empties that couldn't get out. This logjam along the coast created a rail car shortage to the tune of 143,000 rail cars farther inland. By 1916, it was clear that a lot more investment was needed, not just for port facilities, but also in locomotives and rolling stock. After the U.S. declaration of war on April 4, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson attempted to get things moving with the creation of the War Board. The presidents of 70 railroads met in Washington, D.C. to select from among themselves the 5 members of the board. It was hoped the War Board would foster better coordination among the railroads. 635 railroads gave the board power of attorney, but that was about the extent of the board's power. To get the railroads to play nice with each other, the board's only real weapon was the power of persuasion. The War Board implemented the issuance of priority tags that were to be affixed to rail cars carrying high-priority loads. This turned out to be a disaster since federal railroad agents began handing them out indiscriminately or as personal favors to railroad management. It got to the point where 85% of the traffic on the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pittsburgh division was moving under priority orders, and this is only one example. To make matters worse, the railcar shortage had ballooned to over 180,000 cars. Had World War I never happened, or if the U.S. never became involved in it, the railroads probably would have been left to sort this mess out on their own. But with the U.S. inching closer to war with Germany in 1916, and matters only getting worse under the War Board, there were those in Washington, D.C. who saw the handwriting on the wall. Enter the United States Railroad Administration. The United States Railroad Administration, or USRA, was created by President Woodrow Wilson on December 26, 1917, under the authority of the Army Appropriations Act of August 26, 1916. However, funding for the USRA wouldn't come until the passage of the Federal Control Act of March 1, 1918. President Wilson tapped his Secretary of Treasury and son-in-law, William Gibbs McAdoo, as the first director of the USRA. While McAdoo was an advocate for the permanent nationalization of American railroads, and most assumed this was a total seizure of the railroad industry by the federal government, that wasn't exactly the case. Of the 635 common carrier railroads in the U.S., Only 90 came under USRA control. Since the U.S. was only fighting in Europe, the eastern half of the U.S. was most affected by the war effort. The major industrial centers and the railroads that served them were located primarily east of the Mississippi River. Therefore, the vast majority of USRA-controlled railroads were in the eastern half of the United States. The USRA did, however, take operational control over the railroads while leaving ownership in private hands. Secondly, the USRA paid rent to the railroads that was not to exceed the railroad's average operating revenue over the previous 3 years. To the federal government's credit, everyone appointed to key positions in the USRA had deep resumes in railroad operation and locomotive design. While McAdoo's background was primarily in law and finance, he did have a checkered background in railroads. In the early 1890s, McAdoo attempted to electrify the streetcar system in Knoxville, Tennessee. This proved unsuccessful. An ensuing struggle for control over the system and the litigation stemming from it forced McAdoo to abandon his streetcar ambitions in 1897. In 1900, while serving as president of the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad Company, McAdoo oversaw the construction of the Uptown Hudson Tubes, a pair of railroad tunnels connecting Manhattan and New Jersey, which were completed in 1908. Reporting directly to McAdoo was Carl R. Gray as director of the Division of Operations. Gray had held several executive positions at the Western Maryland and Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroads before joining the USRA. While Gray was in overall charge of locomotive standardization, he also formed the Railroad Safety Section of the USRA in May of 1918. Gray required all Class I railroads to form a safety committee modeled on the one created by the Chicago and Northwestern in 1910. But the focus on safety wasn't limited to Gray's efforts alone. The Interstate Commerce Commission submitted recommendations to the USRA on improving engine crew safety and comfort. Also reporting to McAdoo was Henry Walters, general advisor to the Director General. Walters was also a railroad man, having served as general manager of the Atlantic Coast Line and later board chairman of the Atlantic Coast Line and the Louisville and Nashville. Walters was directly in charge of what the USRA would become most famous for, standardizing the design of locomotives to be manufactured during the U.S. involvement in World War I. The driving force behind locomotive standardization was simply economies of scale. By limiting the types of locomotives to be manufactured, as well as making them conform to a given design, they could be turned out in large numbers much more efficiently than small runs of unique designs. While the USRA, as well as the War Industries Board and the U.S. Army, thought this was a good idea, not all of the railroads were in favor of it. The USRA also worked on standardizing freight cars as well. This may have been overkill since freight cars were already more or less of a standardized design. Walters had the chairman of two committees reporting to him. The Builders Committee, chaired by Samuel Vauclane, senior vice president of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, and the Railroad Committee, chaired by H.T. Bentley. The Builders Committee was comprised of 9 mechanical engineers from the major locomotive manufacturers, which were Baldwin, Alco, and Lima. The H.K. Porter Company had 1 representative, Baldwin and Alco had 3 members each, while Lima had 2. Several publications speculated on just what exactly the Builders Committee was going to come up with. Railway Age, an industry publication, claimed 10 locomotive types would be standardized: a 6- and 8-wheel switcher, heavy and light versions of Mikados, Pacifics, and Mountains, and possibly a Santa Fe or a Malay. Another source claimed only Mikes, Pacifics, and Mountains. The committee settled on 6 types with a heavy and light version of each, bringing the total to 12. Railway Age's speculation was closest to the mark. A heavy and light Santa Fe and heavy and light Mallet rounded out the roster of USRA locomotives. Fortunately for the USRA, the Builders Committee was not expected to start with a blank sheet of paper and design all 12 locomotives from scratch. Instead, the committee looked for standout examples of each type already in service and modified the design for rapid manufacture. The general criteria the selected design had to meet was demonstrated utility in general service and modern and sound concept. The USRA light switcher was based on the Chicago and Northwestern M2 class, the heavy Mallet on the Norfolk and Western Y2, and the light Mallet was based on the Chesapeake and Ohio H2 class, just to give a few examples. The committee's tinkering didn't stop there. There was also an effort to standardize parts to the extent where a given part could be used across multiple locomotive types. The Builders Committee's attention wasn't limited to just standardizing locomotives. Tenders were also standardized around one basic design. All USRA tenders were built on cast steel Commonwealth frames. The Commonwealth frames rode on Andrews-style type trucks for freight and switcher locomotives, while passenger locomotives, such as Pacifics and Mountains, rode on built-up Barber-style trucks. The Andrews and Barber trucks were chosen over the more popular Commonwealth type since they were simpler to manufacture. Coal capacity was set at 16 tons across all locomotive types, while water capacity varied. The heavy and light Malay as well as the heavy Santa Fe carried 12,000 gallons. The light Santa Fe, Mikados, and Mountains carried 10,000 gallons, while the heavy and light Pacifics and Switchers had an 8,000-gallon capacity. Mechanical stokers were also included, but Switcher and light Pacific tenders came equipped with coal pushers. While the Builders Committee was focused on the standardization of the overall design of USRA locomotives, they were not given charge over standardizing the patented appliances produced by third parties. Things like live steam injectors, mechanical stokers, valve gear, firebox doors, etc., were placed under the auspices of the Railroad Committee chaired by H.T. Bentley. The United States was divided up into 7 regions, each region headed by a regional director reporting directly to Bentley. Under each regional director, there were 3 mechanical engineers selected from railroads operating in their region. While the men selected had already distinguished themselves as talented and capable mechanical engineers, 3 in particular would go on to new heights during the interwar period. W. L. Kiesel of the Pennsylvania Railroad would achieve notoriety for the M1 class Mountains of 1926. John A. Pilcher of the Norfolk and Western would develop the Class A of 1936, and Alonzo Trumbull was instrumental in the development of the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Virginian H8 class Alleghenies of 1941. After receiving recommendations from the Builders Committee in March 1918, the Railroad Committee could begin their work on standardizing the myriad of appliances used on steam locomotives. The Railroad Committee's job was just as daunting as the Builders Committee. Dealing with the inevitable blowback from the railroads was par for the course, but selecting suppliers for things like firebox doors, injectors, superheaters, throttle gear, and the like required the committee to strike a balance between several competing interests. The committee wanted to select the best quality appliances, but also wanted to avoid giving one manufacturer a monopoly on government contracts. The committee was advised by George DeGuire, General Superintendent of Equipment, to not be overly conservative, but to avoid experimental equipment. He went on to suggest that appliances in development should be considered. Exactly where the dividing line between developmental and experimental is drawn was apparently left ambiguous. What is known is that the feedwater heater was considered experimental at the time and therefore was not adopted on USRA locomotives. The other challenge was to select appliances that were already in widespread use that the railroads were familiar with. Since it was impossible to please everyone, some railroads complained that they not only had to familiarize themselves with new equipment, but were now forced to stock spare parts in multiple locations for equipment that they considered non-standard. The Railroad Committee also took on board recommendations from the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC provided a list of appliances that would enhance the comfort and safety of engine crews by reducing heavy physical labor. Things like pneumatic fire doors, grate shakers, power reverse gear, and cab lighting were all recommended, as well as coal pushers for locomotives lacking mechanical stokers. While every aspect of USRA locomotive design was scrutinized in the name of standardization or safety, there was one small detail that seemed to escape the attention of all involved: a seat for the head brakeman. The cabs of USRA locomotives were one aspect of USRA design that didn't draw any legitimate criticism from the railroads. They were considered roomy by the standards of the time, and provision could have been made for the head brakeman, but as it turned out, he would have to stand or squat for the entire trip. As for the coal pushers, some railroad men considered them superfluous for switcher duty, while others lamented the fact that they were absent from the light Pacifics. By early 1918, both committees had completed their work, but the design of USRA locomotives wasn't the only thing to be standardized. The USRA negotiated fixed prices for each locomotive type, which allowed the builders to realize a profit. Any cost overruns experienced by the builders could not be passed on to the USRA, and if the builders found a way to reduce costs, the benefit was shared between the builder and the United States Railroad Administration. On April 30th of that year, the first order of 1,020 USRA locomotives was placed with Baldwin and Alco, valued at $60 million. Lima wasn't included in the first order since their plant was already operating at capacity, filling pre-USRA orders. Alco was to produce 550, while Baldwin was to turn out 470 locomotives. By mid-June 1918, Lima had worked through their backlog and received an order for 45 USRA Mikados for the New York Central. In October 1918, a second order of 600 USRA locomotives was authorized. This time it was Baldwin that had to take a pass. The War Department had already ordered from Baldwin 1,110 consolidations for the U.S. Army for export to France. It was made standard practice for the USRA to confirm with the military if there was a conflict between military and domestic orders. In Baldwin's case, the military order took priority. The 100 USRA heavy mikes that Baldwin was supposed to build were transferred to Lima, while Alco built the remaining 500 units. Getting the railroads to buy into the USRA's idea of locomotive standardization was only the first battle of the war at home. The next fight came from convincing the railroads to not only accept their locomotive allocation, but also to pay for it. The USRA's first attempt came before the design of all 12 types was finalized. Tentative specifications were drawn up and sent out to the railroads. The USRA asked the railroads to specify the number of each type needed for the following year. The motive power departments of most railroads questioned the suitability of the USRA designs, and the defeat of Germany seeming inevitable by the time the first USRA locomotives were delivered left the railroads wondering if they needed them at all. Since the USRA was essentially running the railroads, it could get a reasonably accurate read on the railroad's motive power needs based on the volume and nature of traffic. The USRA worked out allocations based on this information. Essentially, the USRA was telling the railroads what they needed and expected the railroads not only to accept their allowance, but to pay for it as well. Many railroads argued they were being forced to buy locomotives they didn't need or want, or deemed the allotment excessive. While other railroads argued the USRA should pay for and own the locomotives during the war, then decide how those USRA locomotives are to be disposed of post-war, since this was, after all, a wartime measure. All of this wrangling between the USRA and the railroads called into question just how severe the locomotive shortage was to begin with. Some historians point to the distribution of the 200 stranded Russian decapods due to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. These locomotives were almost exclusively distributed among eastern railroads, and the number of roads receiving these engines was relatively few. 17 in total spread out over 4 USRA districts. This doesn't suggest a chronic pre-war locomotive shortage. However, the war effort did create a need for more motive power than what was currently available. Between 1918 and the end of USRA control in 1920, 1,856 locomotives were built to USRA designs. Of that number, just over 1,600 were ordered in 1918. The USRA didn't order any additional locomotives in 1919 or 1920. By 1919, the railroads realized that the USRA was preventing price inflation for new equipment and began to change their view on USRA locomotives. With the pending end of USRA control with the passage of the Transportation Act of 1920, some railroads wanted to take advantage of the lower prices. They knew that the end of the USRA meant prices would certainly rise. While the USRA did keep freight moving during World War I and produce locomotive designs that would endure until the end of steam, the cost of running the USRA caught the attention of the U.S. Congress. In 26 months, the USRA consumed $750 million. William McAdoo, in his testimony before Congress, justified the cost of the USRA by comparing it to the cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He stated that in 45 days, American artillery alone consumed $762 million in ammunition, while it took the USRA over 2 years to cost that much. $750 million was a lot of money in 1918. The cost of running the USRA for 26 months and the cost of shot and shell consumed during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, for that matter, were both greater than the entire federal budget for 1916. So what did we get for our money? Did the USRA contribute anything significant to the U.S. and her allies in winning the war? Some historians claim the effect was marginal at best. But since the railroads were the first link in the supply chain that kept our troops armed and fed, I think we need to give credit where credit's due. The enduring aspect of the USRA's legacy is the fact that over 5,100 locomotives were built to USRA designs by the end of the steam era. The engineering of these locomotives was so sound that they were improved upon and built well into the 1940s, and in the case of the Norfolk and Western, the 1950s. As for the railroads themselves, the USRA didn't do much to improve railroad infrastructure. In fact, the railroads were in worse physical condition than they were in 1916. It took even more investment of railroad money through the 1920s to recover. In a rare instance of the government learning from its mistakes, the railroads were not nationalized during the U.S. involvement in World War II. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.